Wasabi wallet. Unfairly private.
What's up, everyone? Ben with the BTC Sessions here, and this is your daily session.
Hodl that Bitcoin.
Before we dive in, of course, big shout out to sponsors of the show, Ledn.io. This is where you can use your Bitcoin for a couple of different services. First of which is to stack some extra sats, and this is through their Bitcoin savings account. You can deposit and then earn interest on your Bitcoin paid in Bitcoin. And secondly, they do offer Bitcoin-backed loans. So what this means is you can use your Bitcoin as collateral to secure a US or Canadian dollar loan. And that sits in a dedicated account. It is auditable 24/7. And of course, if you're trying to get your hands on dollars and you don't want to sell your Bitcoin to do so because you're worried the price might go up, this could be an option for you. It also prevents you from incurring a taxable event because you're actually just using it as collateral instead of selling the asset itself. So if you want to check out either of those, there's a link down below. And if you opt to get a loan, they'll give you an additional $50 worth of Bitcoin into your account. And secondly, if you're into Bitcoin, then of course privacy is important. One of the things I use all the time on my phone and on my computer is NordVPN. And basically what it does is it hides your IP address, it helps encrypt your browsing data, and it has a few other added benefits, one of which is to unlock geo-block content, which I really like if I'm trying to watch something that's not available here in my country. So if you want to check that out, there's a link down below you can click on, and it will get you a deal for only $3 a month for this. And with that, let's dive into the news. So I've got a bit of a focus this today on kind of the global banking situation, the global economy, and what's going on, and kind of the implications with Bitcoin, and it just kind of beckons to the fact of why Bitcoin itself is important. So what's going on here? So this is Kyle Bass tweeting about this. If you're unfamiliar with him, if you've seen the movie The Big Short, he's the guy played by Christian Bale who figured out that the financial crisis of 2008 was around the corner, and he started betting heavily against the U.S. housing market in advance and made billions off of it. So this is him tweeting out. He says, further confirmation that Hong Kong and Chinese banks are running out of cash. In the world's most levered, developed economy, this couldn't be any worse. And what he's talking about is that the withdrawal limit on ATMs has been reduced from $1,300 US all the way down to $38 US. So a drop of 34 times. So it is pretty scary, and we've seen this before. But before we get into some of the other stuff that's going on, let's dive a little further into what's going on in Hong Kong. Obviously, there's been a lot of protests in relation to the government. This stemming from a law that was proposed where people in Hong Kong could be extradited to China with really no due process. So if you were to speak up against the Chinese government, well, they could just ship you over to China and you could be tried there, for whatever they deemed the charge would be. So this out of Hong Kong, not so much the title of this story and the main focus, but what they get into afterwards. There were some regulation and crypto guidance passed down, oddly enough, in the midst of these protests, which really weren't nothing special. It's just kind of guidelines for being on good behavior as a crypto ATM or as an exchange business in Hong Kong. But more importantly, what's happening in Hong Kong? As I said, ATMs are running out of cash. So there's bank runs happening all over Hong Kong right now. People are unable to get cash in many locations, and they also just are now looking to officially confiscate bank accounts and assets without any recourse. So Kyle Bass again saying bank runs all over Hong Kong, ATMs running out of cash. There's something more important though. The failed leader Carrie Lam can now officially confiscate bank accounts and assets without recourse. The Hong Kong legal system is essentially gone. So this is especially scary in that if they identify you as somebody protesting, then you could be a target of this. So, protesters, if caught, they could just say, hey, where, your bank account is shut down. You're not allowed to essentially transact. We're going to take all your money. Yeah, it's pretty scary. And so some of the stuff going along with the ATMs here. So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority is basically their central bank, and they said they noticed today that some banks have suspended services at certain branches due to vandalized facilities and traffic disruptions. Bank customers are advised to use online banking or ATM services as far as possible. So they are kind of blaming the banking problems on the branches being closed because of the protesters, which seems it seems like they're kind of trying to place the blame for the problem specifically on the protesters, which I have some trouble believing. And of course that spurred on the bank runs onto the ATMs because people in droves went there to try and get in there and use those ATMs. So it is a scary situation, but we're also seeing in India, the Reserve Bank of India put out this. They said there are rumors in some locations about certain banks, including cooperative banks, resulting in anxiety among the depositors. The Reserve Bank of India would like to assure the general public that Indian banking system is safe and stable, and there is no need to panic on the basis of such rumors. And I couldn't put it any more succinctly than this article. It's never a good sign if the Reserve Bank of India has to reassure customers their money is safe. Again, you're starting to see a bit of a crunch for cash, and there's starting to be, again, bank runs in India. We saw in the past India where they basically overnight got rid of the largest two denomination bills and then went on a banking holiday for a couple days thereafter. So there was this mad dash for people to hand in their bills to the banks to switch them out for the approved bills, many of which people just weren't able to get in time because they gave next to no notice. And what happened with those bills is people ended up still using them, but they just came at a discounted price, so you wouldn't be able to get as much money. But in India, a lot of people, there's the law and then there's what people actually do, right? And so there's still an economy around some of these bills. It's just adjusted for the fact that you can't put them into the bank. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen banking crises like these. So I'm talking within the lifespan of Bitcoin here. The Cypriot banking crisis was a big one. And that's where in Cyprus we saw they saw a lot of things happen there, but anybody with deposits over 100,000 euros essentially had their bank deposits seized and were considered bad depositors, and they all got a haircut on their deposits. So they had to, essentially, it was a bail-in where they had to help pay out whatever was going on with the banks there. They had to pay out the loss of funds, bail out the banks themselves. And beyond that, they also had a restriction on the ATMs, much like you see in Hong Kong right now, where you could only withdraw 100 euros per day. So there was, again, bank runs and people trying to scramble to get cash because there's no other way to do it. And a couple of years later, actually, I think just a year later, 2 years later, yeah, in Greece, we saw the same thing where large depositors were looking at potential haircuts. They were reduced to only 60 euros per day accessible via the ATMs. Banks got shut down. People were worried about their pensions and losing their money. And the thing that I want to talk about here is this in relation to Bitcoin. Yes, Bitcoin essentially fixes this because it's unconfiscatable, or at least it would be very difficult to confiscate on a large scale. People would have to be, you would have to break into people's homes and you would have to find their seeds if they're not encrypted in a certain, if they're not password protected. You would have to do a lot of things to confiscate individually, house by house, from people if you wanted to take their Bitcoin. So, you couldn't just blanket say, okay, only 60 euros a day for everybody. You couldn't just do that with Bitcoin. Now, the issue here is that when you get to the point that you need Bitcoin, that's when it's difficult to get Bitcoin. Because you got to think, if you're restricted to 60 euros a day in Greece, for instance, during this crisis, all of a sudden, sure, you may find it attractive to be in Bitcoin, but if you're only getting 60 euros a day, what are your priorities? You've got to pay your bills and you've got to eat. So you really have zero recourse at that point. You can't start taking that 60 euros and piling it into Bitcoin because you're going to starve. You don't have any other money. Same thing here with Cyprus, with India, with Hong Kong. By the time you need Bitcoin, it's too late. The people that were in Bitcoin before were insulated from this. At least whatever they were holding in Bitcoin is still there, is not confiscated, is self-sovereign money that is very difficult to take away from them. But the people that were sitting in the banks that can be, subverted by the government, you're at the mercy of the banks and the government and whatever happens there. There's no recourse. You can't just say, well, I don't trust this bank anymore. I'm going to take out all my money. Too late. The withdrawals are already cut down. $38 a day. What are you going to do with that? Hong Kong is expensive as fuck. $38 a day does nothing. So I don't know really what to say here. So what happened? Was there a run-up in Bitcoin in these previous ones? Yes, for both Cyprus and for Greece, it drew attention to the fact that Bitcoin was attractive to insulate against these types of things. But where were the run-ups happening? How was it affected? Was it people from Greece and Cyprus? Obviously not. They had no access to capital to start buying Bitcoin. But people took notice and started to say, hey, I could be subject to this. Other parts of the globe, people started to say, maybe I should have a little bit of Bitcoin, just in case this happens to me. So it's neighboring countries and people around the world that look at areas like this and say, I'm starting to understand Bitcoin and why it's important. So it does draw an eye to Bitcoin. It outlines why it was created in the first place. And it's unfortunate that crises like this, like what's happening in Hong Kong right now, that these long lineups of people just hoping to get their money out, that seeing this is what's going to drive home the point of the why of Bitcoin. But I really don't see people smartening up much of any other way other than when there are runs on the price and it goes up, the speculative nature of it. But yeah, it's going to be a mix of the both. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think of what's happening with the banking system in Hong Kong, in India? What about in the past with Cyprus and Greece? Do you think that's going to be a driver for Bitcoin adoption moving forward? Or do you think that it's just the people that are privy to it now that want to learn about it that will benefit, and everybody else is going to be kind of screwed in the short term? Let me know. So moving into that, obviously we've been in a downward kind of price direction for Bitcoin as of late. Of course, we've got to keep that in perspective. But I did like this article here about 5 reasons to hold Bitcoin despite the bearish market. And again, bearish market is a relative term if you're looking just the past few months. But if you zoom out a little bit for the whole year, it's different. Anyway, so Bitcoin is, of course, currently more secure than ever. In fact, it's about double the hash rate securing the network from this time last year. Most recently, we passed around the 108 quintillion hashes per second, which is just insane. But yeah, around this time last year is about 55 quintillion. So it's growing considerably. Bitcoin is becoming more and more resilient. Number 2. Over $7 trillion in value has been transacted over the Bitcoin network. And more importantly, 3.2 trillion of that was in the last year alone. So network usage and the amount of capital flowing through the system is increasing exponentially. It's growing an insane amount. It took 8 years to get the first 3.5 plus trillion. And 8 years, 9 years to get the first 3.5 trillion, and now we've done that in a single year. Now, Bitcoin has paid more than $14 billion to miners. So there was this worry of the mining death spiral as the Bitcoin price pulled back from all-time highs and some miners dropped out. People were worried that miners would just stop altogether. Of course, Bitcoin is built to respond to these type of things, to readjust if miners drop off, to make it profitable again for the miners that were efficient and stuck around. Well, again, miners are flourishing. They're making lots of money if they are efficient, if they're finding efficient ways to get electricity to power their rigs. Which again beckons to the fact that a lot of it is starting to be reliant on renewables, things like hydro, but also where there's inefficiencies with power and energy, stuff like in my home province of Alberta, where up north, a lot of natural gas that's difficult or expensive to get to the grid, that's just being vented into the atmosphere, is actually now being captured, put through a mining rig, and making money instead of losing money. So, excellent example there. So, over the last 2 years, miners have made a ton of money. Again, it took 8 years for miner revenue to reach $5 billion. And by next year, we're already looking to break $15 billion in revenue by sometime in early 2020. So the last $10 billion in revenue essentially will have taken 2 to 3 years as opposed to $5 billion in the first 8. So those profits are growing quite a bit as well. Bitcoin's massive return, again, it's the most, and this is the article that I brought up next here, it's 2019's best performing asset still. We're around 8K. Remember, we started the year at around 3,700, and only a few weeks before that we were down around 3,200. So it's outperformed essentially everything. 268% return on investment in 6 months. So it's tends to be, yes, it's volatile as hell, but it tends to be, if you're a patient person, if you've got a low time preference, then you end up doing the best. And we talked about this the other day about Tom Lee, again, not the greatest person to go to when it comes to calling prices, but he did have a good point that if you miss the 10 best days in the market in any given year, you're getting screwed. On average, you're losing 25%. But if you're in the market for those 10 best days, you're doing quite well for yourself. Maybe not on a specific year, but in the long term, it's been the best performing asset of the entire decade. And there was a lot of disappointment with the launch of Backed, which is the Bitcoin settled futures market where you can speculate on the future price of Bitcoin, and it's actually settled in physical Bitcoin. It started with not a lot of volume. It kind of landed with a thud, but it did indeed launch, which only a few years ago, once again, would have been unprecedented. So why is this good? Well, because when there is another mania, when there is another rush in, it's just another onboarding ramp with actual Bitcoin, not cash settled, with actual Bitcoin that allows people to gain access and get exposure to Bitcoin. The amount of new onboarding ramps that have been built in the past few years is insane. Already, there was a pretty good buildup in 2017, but it really, the market wasn't ready. It was difficult for people to get their hands on the amount of Bitcoin that they wanted. That's opening up quite a bit. It's getting better. Even still, I don't think that the market will be ready when there's another crunch, but more onboarding ramps allow Bitcoin to grow quicker. So all in all, there's a number of points here that put things in perspective and kind of beckon to the fact that Bitcoin is growing and doing new things a lot quicker than we imagine. It's easy to focus on the short term, especially when Bitcoin's so volatile and it gives you kind of these bipolar, you're super excited and then you're super worried because the price can go up and then drop down. It's easy to forget when you zoom out. Bitcoin is still up over 200% this year alone. And it's just because we're always looking at the recent high in comparison to where we are now, that it can be very easy to lose yourself in these massive price movements and not look at what's being built and not look at the general direction of the market. So keep that in mind. If you're new to Bitcoin from the past year, 2 years, and you're unsure, take a look at the big picture and take a look historically at what has happened. Anyways, guys, I'm going to wrap it there. Today was just kind of a let's encapsulate what's happening on a global macro scale and then juxtapose Bitcoin against that and see where the value proposition is. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you're new here or if you've been around for a while, of course, the important things like, subscribe, and share. Always share. It's nice to get more people watching. Secondly, if you want to help out the show in another way, hit up the sponsors I mentioned, Ledn and Nord. Those links are down below. And of course, Wasabi wallet for privacy. If you haven't looked into that, link down below, as well as my explainer video. And if you really liked what you saw, you can always leave me a Bitcoin Lightning Network tip at my tippin.me page. And with that, I am out. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I will see you tomorrow for your daily session.